There's a realm of poetry that I've been really drawn to all my life, that I aspire to as a poet, that I think of in shorthand as the poetry of night. A poetry that is likely coming to us through the influences of surrealism, of symbolism, of what was christened deep image poetry by critics. And I'll go into these things a little bit more in a moment, that I think of as a poetry that's very appealing to our interior worlds. It's not the kind of poetry that's written for the purpose of some performance on a proscenium arch with a lot of fireworks at the end. It's not that it has no performance value, but its reason for being is not that. It's not to push things out as much as to allow things to come up and through the poet and into being. And it's a poetry that is very much conversant with and embracing of several levels of consciousness. So if you think of poetry written mainly in the mode of what we can call realism, which is one way of thinking about the real, we're expecting poetry that's going to give us probably a lot of diurnal imagery that anybody could see. It's objective. But it's not always poetry that's going to draw on other parts of consciousness like the dream or threshold states, hypnagogic states between sleep. It's more likely to stay centered in the moment of its composition or the era that it's thinking about, rather than floating between eras more loosely, which happens in some of the poems that interest me. When I think of the poetry of night, it's a phrase that is like a condensation for me of this larger area, which for my way of thinking is the poetry of silence, the poetry of night, the poem of the dream, the poem as dream. French symbolism, as was true of a lot of the symbolism happening across the arts in Europe in the 1800s, came partly out of a need to replace the position occupied by religion when advances in science meant that the way we thought of religion had to start to change. But there was still this need to have the kinds of experiences that people would go to religion for. This happens in a lot of French symbolist poetry, but also in other kinds of art from other countries happening around that time. The French symbolists were very interested in creating a poem that celebrated and evoked a sense of reverie. The dream, or those states of more floating consciousness that weren't quite in the realm of the nocturnal dream. They embraced all the senses. You'll find the sense of smell and the sense of hearing in poems that come out of that movement, and also poets that were influenced by that movement. And as opposed to imagism, which is much more keyed into the visual sense only. There was a feeling of blur, the dreaminess that a lot of these writers sought. They would sometimes talk about a poem should aspire to the condition of music, and this was happening at the same time as composers like Debussy, who was a friend of Mallarmé. His music was aspiring to something beyond the condition of music as he had understood it, exploring different kinds of scales and a greater sense of blur in the way something was structured and received. Afternoon of a Faun, the Debussy piece, was written partly under the influence of Mallarmé writing poetry about that same thing. So there was a lot of cross-pollination between art forms as well. By the time we get into what gets christened deep image poetry, and here we're talking especially about people like Merwin, Robert Bly, and James Wright, but also others. The key thing is the way states of consciousness, other than the typical diurnal daily consciousness, are allowed to come into the poem. It's as though different parts of the brain can quickly move in seamlessly into the poem. And over the course of this series, some of the poems that you'll hear explore these kinds of states. As Robert Bly would have it, leaping poetry, where, you know, you're allowing the poem to emerge from these multiple states of consciousness rather than trying to stay in one. These are poems that are evocative, that enact states, that embody things. They're not poems that are trying to prove a point. They're not arguments moving toward conclusion, but they're experiences. The poems themselves are experiences, whether or not, or to whatever degree, they also incorporate experience of the poet. So just to give you an example, I want to start with a poem by Tranströmer, the Scandinavian poet who, not too long before his death, finally won the Nobel Prize, which really pleased me. And I had the good fortune of meeting him when he was visiting Oberlin in the 70s. One of the things that struck me about him above all was his kindness and his ability to be present with someone in a very unassuming way. He made his living not teaching poetry in academia, as so often happens with us these days, but he was a therapist for young children working in schools. And I could just imagine how comfortable young kids would be with him because of the gentleness of his manner. Tracks. 2 a.m., moonlight. The train has stopped out in the middle of the plain. Far away, points of light in a town, flickering coldly at the horizon. As when a man has gone into a dream so deep, he'll never remember having been there when he comes back to his room. As when someone has gone into an illness so deep, everything his days were becomes a few flickering points, a swarm, cold and tiny, at the horizon. The train is standing quite still. 2 a.m., bright moonlight, few stars. This is a poem that, in addition to the kinds of things I was just talking about, I often think of as an ontological poem, a poem of being, where this situation is evoked with just a few fragments or short sentences about what the speaker notices, almost as though they're stills in what will be a moving series of pictures. And then in the middle of the poem, he moves from these things that can be seen, what we can think of as objective correlatives, if you go back to Eliot, things that we can see out there that have an impact on us, that's more interior in its feeling, into this zone of the dream and into then this zone of illness. And so there is more of a connection as he moves from these very, very short fragments of things being noticed into what's coming up from below that inhabits the middle of the poem before we go back out to just the facts now. 2 a.m., bright moonlight, few stars. And another thing that I think is interesting about the way this poem works is notice how we feel close, or at least I feel close, to the speaker because there's no distance in a way, for all this distance, between the voice of the speaker and what's noticed. The speaker's completely present with this. And yet, the word I never arises in this poem. We feel the I of the poet, but it's not a poem of proclamation. And when we get into those two interior stanzas, it's someone or a man, not I. So even if these are things that the speaker might have experienced himself, I think part of the reason they resonate is there's for a moment something just a little bit impersonal about the way those are phrased so that they become universal. Yeah, of course, I know what it's like to dream that deeply, or I hope I don't always feel that sick, but these are human experiences that feel like the experience of being in this train, still in the middle of, as Bly has it in his translation, a field. This is a Robin Fulton translation from The Great Enigma. And, you know, in the middle of nowhere, I always see snow, even though I don't think that word comes up in the poem, but it feels like a snowy scene. At least it's a very barren scene with just these few things visible. Robert Hass, who I mentioned before, and Helen Vendler, a great critic who has recently died, talk about how, and it's something that I've also been drawn to, how vast and spacious the poems of Tranströmer feel, in spite of the fact that they're so minimal. There are so few words on the page often, not in all of the poems, but many of them, especially the early ones from the first few books, were incredibly distilled. But because of the freedom of movement that happens from, you know, one part of the mind to another, there's this feeling of the vastness, the spaciousness that is being opened up to.